This is why I strongly believe that some of the most overrated players in NBA history are John Stockton, Rajon Rondo, and Jason Kidd. Hello everybody, welcome to Awesome Rusty Bucket. Subscribe to the channel if you're over on YouTube and give us a like. It makes a massive difference and it's much appreciated. And check us out over on Spotify if you want to enjoy this as an audio-only experience. We're back with Hot Take Tuesdays on Friday. We mentioned in the last Hot Takes we're going to be doing this 2 times a week until the NBA season finally gets here because, let's be real, there's all to talk about at this point. I shouldn't say that word this early in. But yeah, let's get into it. From Edward Mace, hot take, the NBA should acknowledge Tim Duncan's quadruple-double in Game 6 of the 03 Finals. Miscounting the blocks robs a piece of history. Not that Timmy cares about this. Yeah, I agree with this statement for the most part. I would just add that the NBA hasn't ever done anything like this, to my knowledge, like changed a box score 20 plus years after the game happened. I've watched the highlights of this game, obviously, and there were there's some blocks that are like debatable how much they actually should be, given towards Tim or not. I think he got the quadruple double, but it's not like it's completely cut and dry. It's not always as if every block is very, very obvious as to who it was on or if it even is a block to begin with. Sometimes scorekeepers fuck that up. I understand why it happened. I understand your side of this as well. I think most people who are in the know about Tim Duncan essentially recognize this game as having been the quadruple double. I don't know what to do with that, but sure, you're not wrong. From Bucks and 6 always, Dwight Howard should have made the NBA top 75 over Anthony Davis. His peak is getting insanely underrated. He was DPOY 3 years straight and led his team to the finals as the #1 option, beating LeBron to get there. AD never once got close to sniffing the finals as the #1 guy. That's definitely true, the last thing you said about him, but frankly, Anthony Davis is not the person that I would knock off of the NBA's top 75 list. I think the mistake that the NBA made in the top 75 is that they didn't they didn't remove anybody from the initial 50. And I can recognize why they did that from like a historical precedent standpoint, from like not wanting to disrespect older legends of the game. But let's be real, there's a bunch of players in that top 50 that have been eclipsed by more than just 25 NBA players throughout history, throughout the time since the last top 50 list, which was in sometime in the 90s. With that said, Anthony Davis is far from the first person I would pick to take off of that list. Anthony Davis is definitely a top 75 NBA player ever. Sure, he didn't get close to the finals as the #1 guy. That is indeed true, but I don't really think that's his fault. Like I said, he's just not who I would knock off the list. It almost feels a little bit targeted towards AD for that reason. From NBA Backcourt Media, Devin Booker is still better than Anthony Edwards. I need to see the full season of an elevated Ant before I comfortably put him above someone like Booker, who has had great playoff moments of his own while being better in the regular season as of now. I feel like people are prematurely putting Anthony Edwards in conversations that he doesn't quite belong in yet. I agree to an extent. I actually do think that Devin Booker is marginally better than Anthony Edwards. Truth be told, though, as it relates to the shooting guard position, whether you're going with Book, whether you're going with Mitchell, or whether you're going with Ant, I really don't think you can go wrong, and I also really don't think there's some giant disparity between any of them in terms of overall talent. Anthony Edwards actually has a little bit better of an all-around game than Devin Booker, but I would say that Devin Booker is the better overall offensive player and especially the better scorer. And Anthony Edwards, still, every once in a while, you get a glimpse of younger Anthony Edwards in there. That's a thing that a lot of players deal with, where they are achieving their potential, but every once in a while you see glimpses of the more flawed version of them, and you don't really get that with Devin Booker anymore. He's essentially great. Like, everything he does, he's consistently making the right decision all the time. Anthony Edwards, sometimes there are moments where it's like, that was a little rough. So just for that reason alone, I would give Devin Booker the edge there. I don't think it's some huge difference, though. Sure, I don't think Ant is like a bona fide, without a doubt, superstar right now. I don't think Devin Booker necessarily is either. They're both guys who are more on the fringes of that to me. But yeah, I'm okay saying Devin is currently better than Ant. I don't know if that'll be the case a season or two from now, and I do think that Ant will peak higher than Devin Booker. From Finn on Tren, hot take, it is impossible to make the NBA and damn near impossible to go D1 if you weren't born into a basketball sports household or you don't have money for AAU. Yeah, this is an unfortunate part of basketball right now, the NBA right now, is that essentially the AAU circuit is determining the guys who end up coming in the league, which has a lot of negative things. First of all, it's a little exploitative of these kids. It also puts a lot of strain on their body, which results in them having injury issues when they make it to the league because they were playing too much basketball too constantly. Like, there's stories you hear of guys playing like 2-3 full-length basketball games in the same day, which you shouldn't ever do. That's insane to put that on anybody, let alone a bunch of kids, with many of them not being ones who are going to make the league. And there is also a financial barrier towards getting into the AAU. As you mentioned, if you don't have a household that can afford it, odds are you're not going to make it. And it's really difficult. You have to have a ridiculous, super prevailing level of talent. And unfortunately, most people are not going to be so obviously talented that they can escape the fact that they're not playing that game. It's unfortunate. And I think there was a video, I don't remember the name of the YouTuber, if someone can find it. Is the NBA becoming a daddy's money league? In many ways, it is. And that is unfortunate because you don't really get the stories of like people coming up from poverty and shit, which that's its own can of worms, and like how much that system exploits people and pushes them into going for a career as difficult but also lucrative as basketball to, you know, save your family and bring them out of the trenches. That's also got its own negative aspects, but I still prefer that to your dad needs to have money in order for you to be an NBA player. That's whack, and I'm hoping that there will be some sort of reform to how that system works in the future. From Getting Nice, the way this era of NBA fans romanticize the idea of carrying to the point where they respect it more than actually winning is probably the worst part about the NBA currently. With young teams, the first thing we say is they need to move this vet because he's going to take the ball out of our young players' hands. And when it's finally time to compete, it's we need to find guys that don't need the ball. It's to the point where it's frowned upon when a star player has guys who can score on their own and is comfortable doing so. Example, Jason Tatum. Ironically, this actually lines up a lot with the newest deep dive that we're currently working on, which is about Wilt Chamberlain, and specifically guys like Jason Tatum, you know, not having as outlandish stats and not being so clearly carrying the team, and people ultimately criticizing him for that, which doesn't really seem fair because that's essentially the ideal situation. Like, yeah, that's exactly what you want. A star player who doesn't have to do too much. That's how you build a good roster. But now we're like, can't give credit towards a superstar player for winning a championship if his team is good. And it's like, that doesn't make any fucking sense because 9 times out of 10, it's going to be the case where the team that wins a championship is good and doesn't rely too much on a superstar. So the fact that we're like giving more credit towards players who ultimately do not win but carry more, I agree that that is bad, and it really does fuck with discourse to a degree where it's like, look, I understand respecting carrying and you're allowed to really care about that aspect of it, but winning is the goal at the end of the day, and if a superstar player wins with good teammates, what's the problem? I really don't get it. And I'm starting to feel bad for Jason Tatum because it seems like he won a championship and got worse in people's minds, and it's really silly. This is in response to another take from the previous video. That's one of the things I actually like about these doing it this way with the comment format is every once in a while there's discourse about a previous take that ends up being interesting. But from Patrick 05 Morgan, the whole point of bringing up 2011 is that LeBron played terribly in that series. If LeBron played better and D Wade won that finals MVP, he'd get criticism, but he'd potentially have three-peated. Yeah, that's essentially what my take was. Winning is ultimately better than losing. If you want to hear more thoughts on that take, look at the previous one. But yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. This is another another one in response to a take. It's actually like 3 videos in a row now, but we've been talking about GMing and people, NBA fans or NBA YouTubers potentially being able to do that job, and I'm vehemently against that idea. But from Perry Dimes, the GM thing is funny because the number one skill necessary in management in general is, in fact, people skills, which is the number one skill lacking in overly online nerds. Yeah, I cannot emphasize enough, like, just because you can make a trade that you think makes sense in 2K doesn't mean you can actually negotiate that deal with another real-life human being whose job is to screw you over as much as possible. That is a skill set that is extremely underrated and not talked about in the job itself. I feel like a lot of people just view the job strictly by the transactions, and it's just not as simple as that. It's same thing I feel about talking about basketball in general, is there's a lot we can see, there's a lot we can discuss, but there is a degree of not knowing that will always be veiled by the fact that we are not inside the locker rooms talking to these people, seeing what the plan is, seeing how many things are mistakes versus just things not actually going their way, how much things are in players' control, how much players like each other. All that shit, think it needs to be recognized a little bit more. A lot of people talk about basketball like they are in these locker rooms, and it's a little ridiculous. Getting nice again, another pretty good take. So look at you, you get in the video twice. I hate when people say give Luka Tatum situation and he'd be more successful, because it's false. Jaylen Brown doesn't develop past being a 3-and-D guy with Luka. Smart gets moved earlier because he doesn't fit. Derek White stays Spurs. Derek White in Boston if Luka's there, and Horford or Tice doesn't work because of Luka's poor defense and them being poor lob threats. You're now banking on an injury-prone Robert Williams. Did I mention you have to wait 2 years for Kyrie to leave? Meanwhile, Dallas gets you a Brunson, Tatum, Porzingis big three that probably wins more than the Celtics currently have. I understand you're taking this from the logistical, like if they had drafted Luka and built him up to the point where they end up winning a championship. I do agree that there are nuances to that people are leaving out. I think what they're saying, though, is if you just swapped them now, like if you were able to do a Jason Tatum for Luka Doncic trade right now, Luka would be a much better player for that reason, or wouldn't be a much better player. The Celtics would be a much better team. They'd probably be a fucking dynasty. I'm sorry, but I absolutely agree with that perspective. And this assertion that Jaylen wouldn't develop past being a 3-and-D guy, I don't agree with that, because first of all, Jalen Brunson did develop a lot of his on-ball ability with Luka there, not to the extent that he did in New York, obviously, but he did showcase it quite a bit. It was more Dallas's fault for not recognizing that he had more to give. Jaylen Brown also, like, I just don't think that's true. It's not like there aren't enough shots. And a lot of the reason that Luka even shoots the ball as much, does as much as he does on the ball, is that he doesn't have teammates that can do things with the ball in their hand. Obviously, Kyrie Irving can, but everybody else on the roster is someone that needs to be set up. That was built around the fact that Luka is a great playmaker, but in reality, it would be best if he was in a system that actually used him a little bit less so that he doesn't have to carry the load as much as he does. I get what you're saying. I don't know that Smart would get moved because he doesn't fit. He's a really good defensive guard who is mostly an okay three-point shooter. That's someone who you would definitely keep around Luka for an extended period of time. I also don't know why you wouldn't make the Derek White trade. Also, Al Horford. Also, who gives a fuck about Daniel Tice? But Al Horford not being a lob threat, sure, but he's also a floor spacer. So now you have that alternative. It's a different way of spacing. You don't strictly have to have a lob option with Luka just because that worked well in this previous year. I agree that it's not as simple as, well, if you just swap them, because that's not what it would actually look like. But saying, hey, if Luka had Porzingis in a more ideal role than being a second option, Derek White, Jaylen Brown, Drew Holiday, that he would win a championship with that team, that's a completely reasonable take. I'd say it's a correct take. So I'm not going to agree with you as a whole. From Saturn's 473, efficiency is an overused stat, and I believe that when looking at efficiency, you should also look at the team's offensive rebounding and other metrics. That is interesting. That's a thing that I thought a lot about the Knicks in this previous playoff run, because a big part of their identity was like, yeah, we're not the most efficient team in the world, but we end up getting more shots than everybody because we have a bunch of phenomenal offensive rebounders, and we just get more opportunities at scoring, which ultimately results in more offense. I think that's true. However, I don't know if that's all that applicable. I don't know if that's the system that you're typically going to see pretty much in most cases. There aren't a lot of teams who make their identity something like offensive rebounding, so I don't know about that. Also, there are certain series where players like across the board were just inefficient because it is a defensive, like drag it out dog type series. The game that I can think of that I often see criticized is, I think it's Kobe in Game 7 of the 2010 finals, shot like 25% from the field. But when you look at how everyone else played in that game, he didn't shoot much worse than everybody else did. You got to take the context of the game. It's definitely important. But yeah, I don't disagree. From Ari Crud, your point about Luka and Jokic being the same, but one is a guard and the other is center, isn't quite true. I understand why everyone likes to point to Luka's playmaking, but part of playmaking is being a willing passer. Luka can make great passes, but unlike Jokic, he will mostly tend to take an awful shot over passing it. His lack of willingness to pass puts his playmaking ability solidly below that of Jokic. If you want to say that Luka is a worse playmaker than Jokic, I can get behind that, but I wouldn't attribute that to him taking bad shots. First of all, Luka is such a good scorer that he very rarely takes a bad shot. I understand like viewing a step back three as a bad, inefficient shot, but the reality is Luka shoots them really fucking well. Really great 3-level score, extremely efficient in every area, plus gets to the free throw line all the time. So I don't agree that Luka opts for bad shots over passing all the time. I think the thing you're talking about with a willingness to pass, I think that's entirely based on the fact that Jokic is a center. Luka has to dribble the ball, he has to initiate pretty much all of the offense, so a lot of the time he ends up opting for a shot. But when you look at the difference between the teammates that they have, again, other than Kyrie Irving, Luka essentially has to set all these people up and no one else is going to score the fucking ball. So Jokic is passing to teammates who he can rely on competently creating more offense from there, when that's not the case with Luka. You can't rely on PJ Washington or Daniel Gafford to create offense consistently. And for that reason, yeah, he'll opt to take a shot over setting up a teammate, but a lot of the time setting up a teammate looks very different for Luka than it does for Jokic. I think their ability to pass is pretty similar, and it's really just their difference in systems that changes it. And as I mentioned about Jokic essentially just being center Luka and Luka being point guard Jokic, is that being a center doesn't necessitate dribbling the ball all the time, where how Luka has been utilized at this point in his career is necessitating that. And that limits how impactful of a playmaker you can be, because a lot of the time the ball is swinging around for the team in general. The Nuggets in general move the ball, where the Mavericks in general move the ball when Luka is moving the ball, not just across the board. From D'Lo's Strongest Soldier, hot take, ignoring resumes, you could argue that Jokic is the best center of all time, and his peak is either as good or better than any other all-time center's peak. That is an interesting perspective, to say the least. I am going to have to disagree with you on that front. I think that Jokic is essentially the best offensive center of all time. In fact, I don't think that's up for debate. However, the center position is one, unlike any other position, where I'm going to look the most at your defense. Defense matters more at the center position than it does at any other position. You can have a great defensive center and that be the only good defender on your team, and you still have a top 5 defense. Look at all of those Utah Jazz teams when Rudy Gobert was being a bad player the whole time and, totally not helping his team be great at defense. So with that said, Jokic, while I think a lot of people dramatically overstate how bad his defense is, and I think a lot of people think he's a much worse defender than he actually is, he's not a great one. And there's a lot of players, especially Hakeem Olajuwon as an example, Bill Russell as an example, who just is way too good defensively, like all-time great defenders, and then it's not as though they're slouches offensively. I would give Jokic the crown of best offensive 5 who's ever played the game because he's unstoppable one-on-one, has some of the best touch I've seen. Actually, I will say the best touch I've seen from any player ever, and he's a pretty good jump shooter on top of all of that, and obviously the passing. But the whole package of what he brings to the table, he's not like the most exceptional rebounder in the world. He's a damn good one, but he's not like, holy shit, way better at rebounding than everybody else, and he's not a great defender. A great defender, mind you. I'm not saying that underhandedly to imply he's a bad one. I don't think he's a bad one. He's not the greatest, and I don't really think he will have much argument for that. From Ronald Mibielli, the concept of a pass-first point guard is insanely overrated. No team in history has succeeded with a player like that as their franchise player, except for the Showtime Lakers, but either Magic wasn't just that, and he had an exception to the rule because he was a generational talent. You can search throughout the history. Almost every single team built around players with these attributes managed to do nothing. Yeah, the way that I feel about this is that if you want your point guard to be your third best player and he's a pass-first guy, that's fine and that will work. But if your best player or your second best player, but especially your best player, is primarily known for their ability to pass the ball, that's a problem. You want somebody who is going to score the ball extremely well and not just be, someone who can score. Like, this is why I strongly believe that some of the most overrated players in NBA history are John Stockton, Rajon Rondo, and Jason Kidd. Now, I don't think Rondo, I mean, maybe he very briefly did after the big 3 got traded, but Rondo really wasn't the number 1 on a team, but there was a point where he kind of dictated all of Boston's offense, and I think that limited them in many ways. And yeah, just in general, you shouldn't have your offense dictated by somebody who doesn't want to score the ball. You need somebody who's going to score the ball to be the lead initiator of your offense. Obviously, Jason Kidd got his team to the finals, but he had a good roster around him, and also the East was pathetic in the early 2000s. Yeah, I agree with this wholeheartedly. And it's the main reason I think John Stockton is extremely overrated, because having someone dominate the assist column to the degree that John did just does not work. It doesn't work. It's a losing strategy. And you mentioned Magic Johnson is an outlier. That's why I consider him the greatest playmaker of all time, because there's no one else who playmakes at that high of a volume and then still succeeds. There is a cap to how much you should actually playmake, and, Magic is the only one who doesn't seem to have that cap. LeBron, 2020, he did it, double-digit assist for a championship run, but other than that, hasn't happened. Hasn't happened a single time. From Reptile King 6767, hot take: a DPOY should be elite/useful when guarding all areas of the floor and switching on all areas of the floor. The same way people talk about 3-level scorers, people should talk about 3-level defenders. I understand where you're coming from, especially in the modern NBA where versatility is gospel. But as far as I'm concerned, there are a lot of ways to be impactful defensively, but it's primarily as a rim protector. And if you do that really well, I can excuse being a little wishy-washy on the perimeter. The irony is we're obviously all thinking about Rudy Gobert right now, and I'm sure that's who this is talking about. But he's definitely not as bad on the perimeter as people would give you the impression. In fact, I saw a YouTube compilation, or not a YouTube compilation, it was a Twitter video of every single possession where a perimeter player tried to score one-on-one against Rudy Gobert, and they went like 7 for 21, I think, which is not good at all. Rudy is not as bad at those things as a lot of people think there is. But that aside, as long as you're the most impactful defender, I think you should be the DPOY. And that's why Rudy has won it so many times, because he hasn't had good defenders around him to this point in his career up until being in Minnesota. I agree with the general principle. That's why I do ultimately feel that Anthony Davis and Bam Adebayo are better defenders than Rudy Gobert. But if you're the number one reason that you have a really good defense, especially if you're the only reason, I completely understand you getting that award. And I also strongly feel that the DPOY should universally be a big man's award. An exception here or there for a wing, but even as the game becomes more perimeter oriented, being able to protect the rim is the most important thing. It will always be the most important thing. So long as you do that correctly and do it very, very well, I am perfectly all right with you being in DPOY conversations. From Apple 98103, hot take: if LeBron James is still a top 10 player in the league, he should be doing far better with the tools he has in LA. AD, Austin Reeves, and Rui. I think it's the literally everything else beyond those guys that is the problem. I understand where you're coming from. I think injury is also a factor. I think Anthony Davis was pretty fucking healthy this previous year, but other than that, LeBron has not been healthy all the time. And yeah, I do understand where you're coming from. However, I don't think you should evaluate it just as simple as how that team performs. I think LeBron's doing pretty much everything within his power. Also, the thing with LeBron being a top 10 player, he definitely is, but he's not often playing like it because he is playing really reserved. LeBron will play really reserved for a large portion of the game and then turn it on at a certain point. Every once in a while, he'll have a stretch where he has it on for like every game, and it's fucking amazing. More often than not, LeBron is playing fairly reserved, and I know people sometimes will criticize him for that, but I think that's the only thing to do at this stage of his career. If he has any hope of continuing being a dominant force, he can't go 100% all the time at the age of 39. It's just too much to bear. That said, if you want to say because of that factor, he shouldn't actually be considered top 10 because he's not playing like it all the time, I get where you're coming from. The reality is, at this age, at this stage of his career, LeBron needs a team around him that can do well without him. And that's the thing with the Lakers, is they don't do well without him really at all. And he can still be you can be a top 10 player and your team doesn't live and die by what you're capable of doing. So yeah, I don't quite agree with you there. From @exo Irvin, this is going to be the last take of the video. The only reason why I disagree with the idea that Magic is on a stratosphere of his own in playmaking is because he had some of the best players of all time on those Lakers team. He had damn Kareem, the number 2 in points all time. He is a good playmaker, don't get me wrong, but his assists reminded me a lot of John Stockton. Oh boy. He had Diddy Malone with him, so he could get easy assists for him. On the contrary, someone like LeBron 2018, where the offense is entirely dictated by him, he has to get his teammates open. He had to pick apart the defense. But other than that, I agree with a lot of what you have to say. I couldn't disagree with you more that Magic is a John Stockton type of assist factory. There is a dramatic difference between how Magic approaches playmaking and how John Stockton approaches it. First of all, I don't know how many assists actually end up being to Kareem, but Kareem isn't necessarily the best option of a second star to get assists. He's definitely not. Karl Malone is far more the case. Kareem will actually take his time in the post. The thing about Karl is that he would make a decision with the ball. He would go up with it within 3 seconds of catching it. He's either going to face up and shoot a mid-range shot, put an elbow in you and go for a hook shot, or pass the ball. So when you pass it to him on the block and he makes a decision immediately, you get an easy assist that way. But Kareem, it's not so much the case. He had a lot of good offensive players around him, but a lot of the reason they were so good is because they had such a phenomenal playmaker setting him up. You can't make that same argument for John. It's far more You know, it's like a chicken versus egg thing. John was benefiting off of Karl far more than Magic benefited off of Kareem. The reason I think Magic is in a stratosphere of his own in playmaking is because he is. I don't even think there's much of an argument. I mean, in terms of ability, watch the fucking highlights, man. Do you see the passes the guy throws? Like, and I'm not just talking look at a mix. Watch a full game of a high assist game from Magic, which is most of them, and then watch a high assist John Stockton game. And then look at the contrast in how these teammates are being set up. Magic is often driving inside, creating some sort of matchup issue where the defense has to collapse. He's kicking out to like Byron Scott for a mid-range jumper or a cutting James Worthy. A lot of his playmaking prowess, the best of the best for him, was when he was on the fast break. He had a bunch of teammates who could run. I agree wholeheartedly that Magic's playmaking ability was maximized pretty much to the fullest degree that it could have been, but that doesn't take away from the fact that he had to be that level of playmaker for it to work as effectively as it did. Could not disagree more with him being on a similar level or it being similar to John Stockton. No fucking way. There are not that many easy assists, just a free assist for Magic available. That was it. Shout out to Nick for editing this video. Goodbye.